Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. A winter wind cuts across the Lehigh River, but it no longer carries the smell of sulfur or the taste of iron that once meant money to every family in this valley. 5 massive blast furnaces, reaching 230 feet into the gray sky, stand like skeletal remains of a giant that once physically constructed the modern world. Walk these grounds today and your footsteps are the only sound in an unmistakable reality of silence that settled over this town on November 18th, 1995, ending 140 years of fire and thunder. But rewind 81 years. It is September 1943. The air isn't cold. It's screaming at 2,400 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the forge shop, 10-man gangs are wrestling with 50-ton steel ingots, shaping them under hydraulic presses like they are squeezing a banana. The heat is so savage that workers wear long underwear beneath heavy leather gear not to stay warm, but to keep the furnace fire from searing their skin. These men are swallowing 20 salt tablets per shift just to replace what pours out of their bodies in the darkness, driving the machines at 101% capacity because their manager, Eugene Grace, decided that physical limits were merely suggestions. At its peak, Bethlehem Steel was a force of nature. It employed 300,000 souls, produced 1/3 of all armor plate used by the United States military in World War II, and built more warships than any other company on Earth. Its steel forms the skeletons of the Golden Gate Bridge, the Hoover Dam, and 80% of the New York City skyline. It was an empire that seemed too big to fail and too heavy to break. And yet, in 2003, it was liquidated for a fraction of its value, leaving behind thousands of broken promises and a pension crisis that shook the nation. Was the fall of this colossus the inevitable result of global capitalism, or the unforgiving mathematics of an American management that watched the world modernize and refused to follow? Did your grandfather work the night shift in front of these industrial cathedrals? Maybe you still cross a bridge made of their forged steel every morning? Share your family's story in the comments. I'm your host, and this is Industrial Aftermath. Now, let's begin. To understand the scale of what Bethlehem Steel eventually became, you have to look past the 5 rusting furnaces and see the Lehigh Valley as it was in the middle of the 19th century. It was a place of quiet faith and agrarian rhythms, settled by Moravians, a religious community that sought peace in the Pennsylvania wilderness. But in April 1857, a Moravian merchant named Augustus Woolley saw something in the riverbank that had nothing to do with quiet contemplation. He saw the future of American transportation, and it was forged in fire. Woolley was a man who understood the merciless arithmetic of logistics. The Lehigh Valley Railroad was expanding, and every mile of track laid required a staggering amount of iron. Rails were the internet of that era, and Woolley recognized that the demand for them was about to explode. He convinced a group of railroad investors to gamble on a new venture, the Saucona Iron Company. It wasn't a grand empire yet. It was a strategic choice born of necessity. They needed rails. Rails required iron. Iron required furnaces. And furnaces required the kind of capital that Woolley secured from men who viewed the Pennsylvania wilderness as an untapped gold mine for industrial expansion. For the first 4 years, the company was a modest operation, but the air in the valley was about to change. On May 1st, 1861, the board made a decision that would forever link the town's name to industrial might. They renamed the venture the Bethlehem Iron Company. The timing was no accident. 3 weeks earlier, Confederate batteries had opened fire on Fort Sumter. The Republic was tearing itself apart, and the Civil War was about to consume iron at rates that no merchant or investor had ever anticipated. The Civil War was the catalyst that transformed a regional ironworks into a monument to industrial ambition. Bethlehem's first blast furnace was finally fired on January 4th, 1863, at a time when the Union Army was desperate for everything the plant could produce. By September of that year, the first railroad rails rolled off the line, destined to move troops and supplies across a fractured nation. Bethlehem had found its true purpose in the forge of war, a pattern of finding its purpose in conflict that would define the company for the next 80 years. As the war raged, the plant floor became a study in organized chaos. The quiet Moravian roots were buried under the soot of progress. The rhythm of hammers began to replace the church bells, and the smell of sulfur became the new perfume of the Lehigh. This era also saw the arrival of the men who would turn this artisan iron work into a technological colossus. In the late 19th century, Bethlehem iron pioneered the Bessemer process in America. This was a revolution in metallurgy that converted molten pig iron into steel that was 16 times more durable than the iron that came before it. Where iron rails once wore down under the weight of locomotives in a matter of months, steel rails could last for decades. By the 1880s, the company's breakthrough moment arrived. Under the technical leadership of John Fritz, often called the father of the American steel industry, Bethlehem won contracts for the armor plating of the USS Texas and the USS Maine. They were no longer just building rails, they were building the arsenal of democracy. The company demonstrated its newfound precision at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, where they manufactured a 45.5-foot steel axle to support the world's first Ferris wheel. It was the largest single steel forging ever constructed at the time, a 45.5-foot testament to precision and power. Engineers from around the world traveled to Chicago just to study it, returning home with a new understanding of what the hands of Pennsylvania workers could accomplish. But even as the profits soared and the furnaces grew taller, the unforgiving mathematics of the industry remained. The work was brutal, and the conditions were a far cry from the Moravian ideals of the town's founders. A man who entered these mills in the 1890s was entering an industrial cathedral that demanded his body as a sacrifice. As the 19th century closed, the Bethlehem Iron Company was prepared to become the most powerful steel company in the world, but it would take the arrival of a swaggering showman from United States Steel to turn this regional power into a global predator. By 1908, the iron works on the banks of the Lehigh River was no longer merely a supplier of railroad rails. It was preparing to become the silent architect of the American sky. While the rest of the steel industry in Pittsburgh remained content churning out standard I-beams, a technological revolution was cooling in the casting pits of Bethlehem. Charles Schwab, having taken control of the company in 1904, recognized a truth that would reshape the geography of the 20th century. The American city had run out of dirt, and the only direction left to go was up. Before this moment, there was a physical limit to human ambition. Manhattan's population had exploded from 515,000 in 1850 to nearly 2 million by the turn of the century. But traditional construction methods, relying on massive masonry walls, limited buildings to about 10 stories. If you tried to go higher, the walls at the base had to be so thick to support the weight that there was no room left for people to actually stand inside the ground floor. The unforgiving mathematics of stone and brick had reached their breaking point. The solution emerged from Bethlehem's new gray rolling mill, which began production in 1908. This facility produced the very first wide-flange structural sections in America, H-shaped beams that distributed weight with a mechanical efficiency that made previous construction methods look like toys. This was the birth of the skyscraper beam. It provided a steel skeleton capable of bearing the entire load of a massive structure, allowing the walls to become mere curtains of glass and stone rather than load-bearing elements. Within 2 decades, this single factory on the Lehigh didn't just supply steel to the world, it effectively owned New York. If you stood on a street corner in Manhattan during the 1920s, 80% of the steel skeletons rising into the clouds around you were stamped with the Bethlehem name. These wide flange beams formed the bones of the George Washington Bridge, the Waldorf Astoria Hotel, and the massive Art Deco complex of Rockefeller Center. The company's chief engineer was known to look out over the forest of towers in lower Manhattan and boast that Bethlehem Steel was the only reason the city could stand so tall. The reach of the skyscraper beam extended far beyond the Hudson. Bethlehem provided the steel for the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco, a project so massive it required metal from 5 different Bethlehem plants. When that bridge opened in 1937, its 4,200-foot main span was the longest on Earth. a testament to the grit and obsession of the workers who fabricated the cables and beams. From the Hoover Dam to the Benjamin Franklin Bridge, the company was physically constructing the infrastructure of a superpower. Every beam that swung into place hundreds of feet above the pavement was a monument to the rhythm of hammers in Pennsylvania. The men at the furnaces endured a heat that felt like a preview of the afterlife so that the world could rise higher. They were fabricating the identity of the modern age, unaware that the very success of their invention was creating a culture of corporate complacency. Management began to believe that because they owned New York, they no longer needed to watch the horizon. They were building an empire of wide-flange steel, but the merciless arithmetic of the future was already beginning to calculate the long, slow silence of the industrial aftermath. While the skyline of New York was rising on the strength of Bethlehem's wide flange beams, Charles Schwab was already calculating a much larger and more dangerous arithmetic. To Schwab, owning the sky was only the first step. He understood that a truly modern empire required vertical integration not just from the mine to the mill, but from the forge to the front lines of global conflict. Between 1905 and 1917, Schwab began a series of acquisitions that would terrify his rivals in Pittsburgh. He didn't just want to sell steel to shipbuilders, he wanted to be the shipbuilder. He purchased the Union Iron Works in San Francisco, the Four River Shipyard in Massachusetts, and facilities across Maryland, New York, and New Jersey. He stitched these disparate sites together to form the Bethlehem Shipbuilding Corporation, creating a manufacturing web that spanned from the Atlantic to the Pacific. This was the birth of the military-industrial complex, decades before the term would enter the American vocabulary. Schwab was positioning Bethlehem to be the primary provider for the merciless arithmetic of war. The payoff for this gamble arrived in August of 1914. As the guns of Europe began to fire, the British government, desperate for the metal that decides the fate of nations, placed a single order for artillery and munitions worth $135 million, the largest in the company's history to that date. Inside the industrial cathedrals of the Lehigh Valley, the pace became a study in organized chaos. By 1916, Schwab recognized that his empire had grown too large for a single showman to manage. He promoted his hand-picked successor, Eugene Grace, to the presidency. If Schwab was the visionary who dreamed in fire, Grace was the engineer of unforgiving mathematics. Grace looked at a factory floor not as a place of sweat and iron, but as a biological machine that could be tuned for 101% efficiency. Together, they transformed Bethlehem into a force of nature that moved with the precision of a stopwatch. By the time the United States entered the First Great Conflict in 1917, Bethlehem was already producing more firepower than almost any other entity on the planet. Their yards were launching destroyers and submarines at a rate that made traditional shipwrights look like amateurs. This was the era of grit and obsession, where physical limits were treated as merely suggestions by a management team that felt they could outproduce time itself. But as the company's bank account swelled and its influence reached into the White House, the American Industrial Compact was being tested in ways the executives at the top ignored. They were building a colossus, a monument to industrial ambition that employed more workers than some states had residents. They could see the fire of the furnaces from miles away, but they were deaf to the growing rhythm of hammers, of a workforce that was beginning to feel like just another raw material to be consumed by the machine. The empire was scaling toward its zenith, unaware that the very scale they craved was creating a weight that would, in the coming decades, become too heavy for the Pennsylvania soil to support. But the weight of this colossus wasn't just measured in steel tonnage or shipyard contracts. To achieve the 101% efficiency that men like Eugene Grace demanded, another radical experiment was already taking place deep within the machine shops of the Lehigh Valley. In 1898, the air in the factory began to taste of a new, cold efficiency. A management consultant named Frederick Winslow Taylor had arrived at Bethlehem Steel, and he brought with him a philosophy that would treat the human body as just another component in a monument to industrial ambition. Taylorism, or scientific management, was the beginning of an unforgiving mathematics applied to human flesh. Taylor stood in the industrial cathedral with a stopwatch in one hand and a ledger in the other, analyzing every single motion a worker made. He wanted to eliminate waste, which in his view included any movement that didn't directly contribute to production. Under his guidance, machine shop output exploded by factors previously considered impossible, but this efficiency came at a cost, measured in broken bodies and exhausted souls. By 1910, the reality of labor at Bethlehem Steel had become a study in organized chaos and endurance. A federal investigation that year uncovered a merciless arithmetic of toil. Over 97% of the workforce had a workday of 10 hours or more. 51% worked 12 hours or longer, and 29% labored 7 days a week with no extra pay for the Sunday shift. The rhythm of hammers never paused. Day shifts ran 11 hours, while night shifts stretched to 13 or 14. But the most brutal calculation was the swing shift every other Sunday. When the shifts changed, night workers were forced to put in 24 consecutive hours without rest. The work itself was a preview of the afterlife. In an era before safety regulations, a man entering the mill at age 20 could expect to live 7 years less than someone working in a quiet office. If you weren't killed by an explosion or a falling object, the carbon monoxide and toxic fumes would claim your health gradually and irreversibly. In 1909 alone, 21 workers died at the Bethlehem plant, and another 927 were seriously injured. One of those men was Joseph Zambo, a Hungarian immigrant who earned less than 15 cents per hour. To Zambo and his colleagues, the disparity between the owners' soaring wealth and their own meager pay had become an unmistakable reality of exploitation. On February 4, 1910, the silence finally broke as 9,000 workers walked out of the gates. They weren't asking for an empire. They were asking for 12 cents an hour and the simple dignity of having Sundays off. Charles Schwab refused to negotiate, viewing unionization as an existential threat to his authority. On February 25th, the tension turned to blood. The Pennsylvania State Constabulary, known as the Pennsylvania Cossacks for their violent tactics, arrived to suppress the unrest. A state trooper, claiming he was being taunted, fired a single round into a crowd outside a local saloon. The bullet struck Joseph Zambo, who had only gone inside to buy a bottle of wine to calm his pregnant wife's stomach. He wasn't a striker. He was simply a man living in a town where poverty had become a crime. The strike ended on May 18th, 1910, with the workers returning to the furnaces without a wage increase. The strikers had lost the battle, but their sacrifice triggered the first federal investigation into industrial working conditions in the American steel industry. The rust stains on the concrete from that era were stains that don't wash away, serving as the first warning that an empire built on the unforgiving mathematics of human misery would eventually find itself reduced to rubble. The seeds of federal labor regulation had been planted, but for now, the machines were running at 101% capacity, and the management remained convinced that physical limits were merely suggestions. Within hours of the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, the monument to industrial ambition on the banks of the Lehigh River underwent a transformation that defies modern comprehension. Bethlehem Steel, which had spent decades building the skeletons of New York's skyline, pivoted to become a vital organ of the arsenal of democracy. This was the era where the unforgiving mathematics of global survival demanded production at a scale that treated physical limits as mere suggestions. Eugene Grace, the methodical leader of the corporation, made a promise to President Franklin Roosevelt that sounded like industrial fantasy. Bethlehem would deliver 1 ship per day. It was a goal that should have been impossible, a merciless arithmetic that required thousands of components to align in perfect synchronization. And yet, the workers in the 15 shipyards controlled by Bethlehem didn't just meet that goal, they exceeded it by 15 ships. By the time the fire stopped, the company had produced 1,121 vessels, a fleet that represented nearly 1/5 of the entire United States Navy's 2-ocean fleet. Inside the industrial cathedrals of the Lehigh Valley, the rhythm of hammers reached a fever pitch. In September 1943, The forge shop was screaming at 2,400 degrees Fahrenheit. 10-man gangs wrestled with 50-ton steel ingots, shaping them under hydraulic presses like they were squeezing a banana. The heat was a physical enemy. Workers wore long underwear beneath heavy leather gear just to keep the furnace fire from searing their skin, consuming 20 salt tablets per shift just to replace the life pouring out of their bodies in the darkness. The factory was running at 101% of its rated capacity because the managers had decided that the requirements of victory outweighed the endurance of machines. During these 4 years of total war, Bethlehem produced 73 million tons of steel. This wasn't just volume, it was the specialized metal that decided the fate of nations. The company manufactured 1/3 of all armor plating and heavy guns used by United States forces, providing the shields for battleships and the barrels for the artillery that liberated Europe. But the most profound transformation wasn't in the metal, it was in the hands that held the tools. As 300,000 souls flooded the company's payroll, several thousand of them were women who had never before stepped foot inside a steel mill or a shipyard. They became part of the broader Rosie the Riveter phenomenon, women who proved they could operate heavy machinery, weld steel plates, and guard facilities with the same grit and obsession as any man. They were the raiderettes of the production line, working through 12-hour shifts and rotating schedules that never paused for holidays or rest. Yet, the American Industrial Compact proved to be a fragile promise for these women. When the war ended in 1945, their contribution was promptly and systematically erased from official corporate memory. To make room for returning male veterans, these thousands of women were fired, their skills discarded as temporary necessities rather than permanent assets. The production records they helped establish remained, but the people themselves were pushed back into the shadows of domestic life, their names missing from the bronze plaques and victory celebrations. As you look at the 5 rusting blast furnaces today, you are looking at the site where the world was saved by organized chaos and absolute scale. The shipbuilding miracle was the zenith of Bethlehem's power, a moment when the company was the 14th largest corporation in the country, and its president was the highest-paid executive in America. But beneath the triumph, the seeds of the industrial aftermath were already being planted. The company had built a world that it would soon prove too rigid to inhabit. The furnaces were hot, the ships were launching, but the silence was already waiting on the horizon. By 1945, the forges of the Lehigh Valley weren't just making steel, they were making the rules for the rest of the world. The company that had functioned as the arsenal of democracy sat atop an industrial world that existed in only 2 states, ruins or dependency. With the manufacturing hearts of Germany and Japan reduced to twisted scrap by Allied bombers, American steel companies controlled a staggering 72% of world steel production. Bethlehem Steel alone was churning out 23 million tons of steel annually, fueling a post-war hunger for cars, suburban homes, and skyscrapers. By 1957, Bethlehem reached its peak, manufacturing more than 19 million tons of steel and earning $190 million on sales of $2.6 billion. Their president, Arthur B. Homer, was the highest-paid business executive in the entire United States in 1958. He was the king of a monument to industrial ambition, but he was ruling over a kingdom that was quietly rusting from the inside out. This was the beginning of the technology trap. While Japan and West Germany were using American Marshall Plan capital to build state-of-the-art mills from the ground up, Bethlehem's leadership chose the comfort of the familiar. They doubled down on the open hearth furnace, the reliable, slow workhorse of the World War II era, while their competitors across the sea were adopting revolutionary basic oxygen furnaces and continuous casting. These were technologies that American companies, including Bethlehem, had actually helped develop but stubbornly refused to implement at scale. The unforgiving mathematics of this refusal were brutal. In an open hearth furnace, a single heat of steel could take between 8 and 12 hours to refine. A basic oxygen furnace could do the same work in less than 1 hour. By 1975, the productivity gap had become a chasm. A Japanese worker needed only 9.2 man-hours to produce a ton of steel, while the men in the industrial cathedrals of Pennsylvania still required 10.9 hours. Bethlehem was trying to compete in a merciless arithmetic of global trade using the tools of their grandfathers. Management's vision was equally rigid. In the post-war period, the United States government offered Bethlehem the chance to operate aluminum plants that had built aircraft during the war. Bethlehem said no. They were committed to being the best steel company in the world, not a materials provider. They stayed in their lane while the world moved toward lighter, cheaper alloys and plastics. In a final massive reach for scale, the company built Burns Harbor in Indiana between 1962 and 1964. They purchased 3,300 acres, destroying ecologically significant sand dunes to create their final crown jewel. It was a masterpiece of organized chaos and peak ambition, but it was delivered at the exact moment when absolute capacity was becoming less important than efficiency. As Bethlehem poured billions into these aging integrated models, a new predator arrived on domestic soil, the mini-mill. These small, nimble, non-union operations like Nucor used electric arc furnaces to melt scrap steel, skipping the expensive and dangerous iron-making process entirely. By the mid-1970s, these mini-mills had snatched 20% of the American market. Bethlehem had the history, the prestige, and the massive brick and steel mosaics of the Lehigh Valley, but they were losing the math of middle-class life. They had built the bones of the 20th century, but they were proving too heavy to survive the 21st. The rhythm of hammers was beginning to fade into the long, slow silence of the industrial aftermath. By the mid-20th century, the American industrial compact felt as solid as a wide flange beam. It was a simple, unwritten deal. If you gave your body and your youth to the industrial cathedrals of the Lehigh Valley, the company would provide you with a life of dignity and a retirement of security. In the 1950s, while Bethlehem Steel was the 14th largest corporation in the country, that promise seemed unbreakable. But beneath the soaring profits and the record-breaking production of 19 million tons of steel, a merciless arithmetic was being calculated in the executive offices that would eventually push thousands of families off a financial cliff. The architect of this looming disaster was Eugene Grace. Grace had led the company through the miracles of World War II, but as the fire died down, he began making a series of corporate choices regarding the company's pension obligations. During the boom years of the 1950s, when Bethlehem should have been aggressively funding its retirement plans, management looked for a way to save $1 today at the expense of a worker's tomorrow. They exploited an accounting loophole called a credit balance, which allowed the company to skip required payments to the pension fund. It looked clever on a spreadsheet in 1957, but it was a technology trap of a different kind, a time bomb buried in the ledgers. The unforgiving mathematics finally caught up with the company in the 1990s. For decades, the industry had followed a cycle. Workers struck, companies gave raises and benefits, and the costs were passed to the consumer. This only worked as long as Bethlehem had no competition. But once the world changed, once the cheaper steel from Japan and the nimbler mini-mills began to dominate, the company was left with an aging workforce and a mountain of debt it had no way to climb. The ratio of retirees to active workers shifted dramatically, and the underfunded pension plan became a chasm that could no longer be bridged. The end arrived with an unmistakable reality of silence on October 15, 2001. Just over a month after the September 11th attacks destroyed the Twin Towers that Bethlehem had notably failed to supply steel for the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It was the 25th American steelmaker in 4 years to seek protection, signaling that the very foundation of the American middle class was being reduced to rubble. The bankruptcy didn't just end the company, it systematically dismantled the American Industrial Compact. The Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, or the PBGC, was forced to step in and take over the plan, the largest such liability assumption in American history. The fund was found to be a catastrophe, With only 45% of its obligations funded, $3.5 billion in assets against $7.8 billion in liabilities. For the 67,000 retirees already receiving checks and the 95,000 workers covered by the plan, the result was a big-time hurt. Russell Stanton, a man who had worked at the Burns Harbor Mill for 31 years, saw his annual pension of $30,000 slashed to $17,000 because of federal limits. But the most brutal blow was delivered in the courtrooms. The bankruptcy court allowed Bethlehem to terminate health care and life insurance benefits for every single retiree. The company had promised coverage for life, but in the world of the spreadsheet, that promise held no legal weight. Thousands of men and women who had breathed the sulfur and felt the 2,400-degree heat for decades were suddenly cast adrift, one medical emergency away from financial ruin. They had fulfilled their part of the deal. They had built the Golden Gate Bridge and the Hoover Dam, but the men who had profited from their labor had chosen to spend the money elsewhere. The rust stains on the concrete in Bethlehem today are the only markers left of a legacy that was erased by the merciless arithmetic of corporate failure. Today, if you stand on the elevated walkway at steel stacks, your footsteps are the only sound in a space that once vibrated with a thunder that could be felt in the marrow of your bones. You are looking at the 5 massive blast furnaces of Bethlehem Steel, 230-foot towers of iron and soot that have become the ultimate industrial cathedrals. They stand in a row like skeletal sentinels, reaching into the Pennsylvania sky, marking the spot where 5 generations of men and women forged the very skeleton of the 20th century. But these cathedrals are empty. The congregation has dispersed, and the god of production has long since left the building. The rhythm of hammers was replaced by an unmistakable reality of silence on November 18th, 1995, when the last cast of iron was poured and the fires were allowed to go cold after 140 years of continuous operation. The tragic irony of the industrial aftermath is written in the way we choose to remember what we've destroyed. We took this monument to industrial ambition, a place where immigrants once labored in 2,400-degree heat for 15 cents an hour, and we turned it into an Instagram backdrop, where 10-man gangs once wrestled 50-ton steel ingots like they were squeezing a banana to arm the arsenal of democracy. Tourists now take selfies. We built a $800 million casino on the ruins, using the old ore bridge, the very spine of the facility, as a grand entrance for gamblers chasing a different kind of luck than the men who once risked their lives here. We are told this is progress, that transforming a polluted brown field into a playground for music festivals and slot machines is the only way to save the history. But as you watch the light fade behind those rusting stacks, you have to ask, is this preservation, or is it a death of sorts? The American Industrial Compact was a deal written in steel. You give the company your youth and your strength, and in return, you earn a life of dignity and a retirement of security. But that compact was reduced to rubble by the merciless arithmetic of underfunded pensions and the corporate choices of men who watched the world modernize and refused to follow. The rust stains on the concrete in Bethlehem are stains that don't wash away. They serve as a haunting reminder that while we can repackage the past into a gift shop or a concert venue, we cannot rebuild the identity that was lost. The city of Bethlehem has adapted, but adaptation is not the same as recovery. The big-time hurt of the 2001 bankruptcy, which terminated health care for life for thousands of retirees, is a wound that a casino cannot heal. In the end, the machines we build become our monuments, but as the fire dies, those monuments become tombs. Bethlehem Steel is still all around us. It is in the Golden Gate Bridge, the Hoover Dam, and the 80% of the New York City skyline that it physically constructed. Those are the true monuments to the grit and obsession of the American worker. The rusting furnaces are merely the echo. That is how empires end, not with a bang, but with a legacy repurposed for a spreadsheet. I'm your host, and this has been Industrial Aftermath. If you believe these stories of fire and silence are worth remembering, leave a like and subscribe to help us keep these doors open. Share your family's story in the comments below. Thank you for watching.